Thank you all for having me. I'm particularly excited to be able to present to this group. As Scott mentioned, not only am I a Montgomery Bird Club member, but I live about 8 blocks from Montgomery County. So I'm almost local, but I have worked a little bit with Montgomery Bird Club, but more so with Maryland Ornithological Society. I'm past vice president of the DC chapter of the Audubon Society and have been longtime chair of the Conservation and Advocacy Committee. So very much a local. So very excited to be able to work with you folks tonight. So my name is Joel Merriman. I'm the Bird Smart Wind Energy Campaign Director at American Bird Conservancy. And the theme of the presentation tonight is Bird Smart Wind Energy, which is a very hot topic for those of you who are paying attention to what's going on in Congress and elsewhere right now. So let's dive right in. So first, for those of you who may not be quite as aware of American Bird Conservancy, we are about 100 staff strong. We're based in the Plains, Virginia, but we're both in the Plains, Virginia and DC in terms of having a real office presence, but we do have staff that are across the US and a few scattered in Latin America. And we were founded in 1994 to conserve wild birds and their habitats across the Americas. This is our pyramid. This just gives a graphical representation of how we do our work and how that's organized. There at the top, you've got the most endangered birds. We do work and are currently chair of the Alliance for Zero Extinction. So we do work to safeguard the most endangered birds. Below that, birds of conservation concern. We want to keep common species common. I'm going to skip the third tier briefly, but then at the bottom is building conservation capacity. We do a lot of work through partners. And ABC does do full life cycle conservation. If we are going to take on a species as one we want to protect, we want to make sure we're protecting it on breeding grounds, wintering grounds, and all the stopover sites in between. We do have field programs throughout the US, and we do work throughout Latin America, and that is primarily partner-based. And so where I land is here on this third tier, which is threats to all birds. We have programs focused on many of the threats that are present for all birds, things like outdoor cats, collision with windows, pesticides, but of course, the threat that I work on is poorly sited wind turbines. So to kick this off, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need renewable energy, and I'm going to focus that specifically on birds, obviously, because that's what we're all interested in here, but it goes without saying that that's just scraping the surface that humans and many other species are currently and will be further affected by climate change. So there are a lot of ways that birds are affected by climate change. I'm just going to cover a few of them here because you can't teach an entire class on that, and I should know I have taken one. So the map that we're looking at here shows how things are going to move as the climate changes, because as the climate changes, the vegetation is going to change, and that's going to cause, generally speaking, a northward and upward migration of these various habitats. And so birds and their habitat must ultimately move north. And for some species, perhaps the vegetation will progress enough that they can continue to remain in habitat. But for those species that exist perhaps closer to the northern coasts, that's going to get problematic because there's eventually nowhere to go. Similarly, species that currently live in mountainous areas are going to have the same issue. They're going to move up, up, up as the habitat does the same until eventually there's just really nowhere to go. So obviously very problematic. With sea level rise, coastal birds and birds of coastal marshes are also going to be squeezed. These marshes are obviously in very flat areas that fluctuate, where the water level fluctuates with the tides. There is a point at which it gets too deep for those ecosystems to continue to function in their current state. And so that's going to be really problematic for species like black rail that's shown here, For those of you with really good eyesight, the photo of the salt marsh here is by your very own Gemma Radko. So I don't know if Gemma's in the audience tonight, but she was kind enough to provide the photo. There was a study that came out just a couple of years ago that looked at the effects of climate change well into the future. It was a modeling exercise on various species of bird. And they evaluated the vulnerability to climate change for 604 North American species. And when they were looking at vulnerability, it was a combination of a given species exposure and sensitivity to climate change, essentially how much they would likely be affected by climate change, as well as adaptive capacity, how well they were likely to actually withstand changes due to climate change. And they looked at this under a variety of scenarios, both in breeding and non-breeding habitat. And the really top line result was that 64% of the 604 species are vulnerable to climate change under the 3-degree warming scenario. So that obviously is a very alarming result and very clear that we need to do something about this. And you can see in the graph here, it's a bit difficult to see, I realize, but looking at different groups of birds, some were more affected than others. Right there at the top, those are Arctic birds. All of the Arctic birds that were examined are vulnerable to climate change. Pretty close on boreal forest birds, that was 98%, Western forest birds 86%, and on down from there. But obviously this is a very serious issue. And this is why we need to transition to clean energy, and we need renewables. So looking a little bit at where we are with renewable energy development, this is getting into just the current setting here. These are graphs on the left here. This is for wind energy, on the right it's solar, and we're looking at the growth of these two industries from 2008 to 2018. And obviously this is a few years out of date at this point, but the main idea here is that there's been a steady growth of wind energy over that 10-year period, whereas with solar, it took a little longer to take off, but then as it approached closer to 2018, the growth actually started to really increase. And at this point, we're really seeing that solar growth is eclipsing wind, though wind is certainly going strong, and we're anticipating that to continue and actually accelerate in the coming years. This is a map from the US wind turbine database, and the green blobs here represent where all of the wind turbines are in the US. And so you can see that there are some areas that have particular concentrations of wind energy development, in particular right there through the Great Plains, right down the middle of the country. There are also some concentrations in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast, as well as the Pacific Northwest and parts of California. And this is actually already out of date as well. We now have over 70,000 turbines in 43 US states. So there's already a good deal of wind turbines on the ground. We also have a very small number of turbines in the offshore space. There are 5 turbines in operation off the coast of Block Island and Rhode Island, which is the first offshore wind energy facility in the US. And there are 2 turbines off the coast of Virginia Beach in Virginia that were installed by Dominion Energy. So offshore wind does have a toehold, but that's another one that we expect to accelerate a good deal. And speaking of which, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of movement on renewable energy development under the Biden administration. Of course, President Biden takes this challenge very seriously and has made some really bold goals and is working very hard to try to address this issue. One of the things that has come from that is there's a pledge to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And that essentially takes us from 6 turbines in all likelihood to thousands of turbines. So that would be moving that new industry forward very quickly. This is a figure that shows what was at one point a prediction for how much wind energy capacity there was going to be in the US in 2020. And this did actually prove to be pretty accurate. They came pretty close. And you can see that there are some states that have a good deal of wind energy, Texas in particular, California, Iowa, Wyoming, some of these states. And you can see a tiny bit of blue there, that's for the offshore. But then contrast that with this figure, which is the prediction for how much wind energy capacity there will be in 2050. And so moving from one to the other, you can see obviously that some of the states that had a lot are going to have just that much more, but there's going to be a lot of growth in a lot of states. And you can see by the blue part of these pies that there's expected to be a good deal of offshore wind energy, and that's not just on the coasts, but in the Great Lakes as well. So we're expecting to see this in a lot of places. And looking at the marine realm, this is a map from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that shows all of the offshore wind energy areas in the Atlantic and Pacific that are currently under discussion. Certainly there will be more down the road. But you can see it's probably a little bit hard to see here, but there's a real concentration in New England, really from New Jersey up through Massachusetts. But then you do have some down along Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Looking off the Pacific coast, there are a few areas being considered off the coast of California. There are discussions underway in Oregon and in Washington State as well. And at some point, we expect to hear more about offshore wind in Hawaii. So again, this is all moving very quickly. So we know that we need renewable energy, and we have a pretty good base, and these are industries that are going strong. But why do we need wind energy to be bird smart? And the unfortunate reality is that this does not come without a cost. Wind turbines kill more than 500,000 birds every year in the US alone. And that really is just looking at the direct mortality. That's looking at birds that collide with wind turbines and are killed. But there is additional mortality that's associated with this industry that comes from the installation of transmission lines. Some facilities are built relatively close to the existing energy grid and perhaps don't need much in the way of connecting lines to feed that electricity into the energy grid. But then there are some that are more remote and need 5, 10, 20 miles of transmission lines to connect into the grid. And we know that power lines are another source of mortality for birds through electrocution and collision. There was a study done that found that between electrocution and collision, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million birds are killed in the US each year. So that is an additional issue. There's also the issue of displacement. Some of these facilities are built in perhaps agricultural lands or otherwise degraded lands that may not be as valuable for wildlife habitat, but there are some facilities that are built in large areas of habitat, be that grasslands or other things. And the construction of these facilities can actually cause birds to relocate. It can render otherwise suitable habitat unusable. And some species, really different species, are going to adapt differently to these turbines. Again, some species, and this is probably particularly those species that need larger contiguous blocks of habitat, may be displaced by facilities. Some, like killdeer, may actually move in where they may not have been there before because there are things like gravel roads and gravel pads that are developed. But birds do vary in how well they're able to adapt to this. And so looking at that a little bit more closely, this is a table that was developed for a state of the science on wind energy and wildlife that was published a couple of years ago. And it shows species of conservation concern that are, there is science that shows that they are negatively affected by wind turbines. And we won't go through all of this because it would take us all night, but there are things like the various prairie grouse are negatively affected by wind turbines. Raptors, it mentioned specifically bald and golden eagle, ferruginous hawk, Swainson's hawk. But there was a study that came out primarily from USGS scientists here just recently that found that there were a number of raptor species that are likely to experience population level declines, specifically as a result of wind energy development. So raptors are big up there, but It's very problematic for bats as well. I'm not quite as savvy on that issue, so I won't say anything that I would regret later. But the point here is there are a number of species that we know are negatively affected by this development. Looking at the offshore space, it's interesting because offshore wind energy is a mature industry in Europe. They've had wind turbines in the water for more than 2 decades at this point. And it's interesting, we have gotten some good science from Europe. And the effects are relatively similar, interestingly, in the water as they are on land. Of course, there is the effect of collisions. The major difference here is it's very, very hard to study in the ocean. When you want to find how many birds are killed by turbines on land, you can walk around underneath the turbines and collect bird carcasses and say, this is how many birds have been killed by these turbines. That's very hard to do in the ocean. So it requires more of a technological fix. And really that technology is still under development at this point, though there's been a lot of progress. There are also barrier effects. And if you look at the figure on the right here, this is a classic study, but this shows radar tracks of sea geese that were flying in the vicinity of an offshore wind facility. And you can see very clearly that for the most part, these birds were not really interested in flying through this wind facility. So it forms a barrier to flight and other behaviors of birds. And then, of course, is displacement. Same as on the land, an area that was formerly used by birds is no longer used. And this is the biggest threat for some species. And the red-throated loon has really become the poster child for this issue. There was a study conducted that found that displacement effects were measurable for red-throated loons to a distance of about 10 miles from operational marine wind facilities. So, so in some areas where there's a real build out of offshore wind, that can get to be really problematic. And offshore wind, which is just getting off the ground here in the US, there's one utility scale project that has been approved, but there are many, many more in the pipeline. So the standard really is still under development here to some degree, but there are some concerns remaining with what we're seeing coming out in these plans. First off, and this is partially due to the evolving technology, but there's not enough monitoring of impacts that's being conducted. And one of those specifically is that there's really not a coordinated plan yet to assess displacement effects. And again, we know this is really problematic, and there are some in Europe where this is an older industry. And there are some areas here in the US where there are a large number of turbines being planned in a given area. So we do need a plan to really look at that, get baseline data, and then ultimately see what the impacts are over time. We also know that there are tens or even hundreds of millions of nocturnal migrant songbirds that make flights over the Atlantic Ocean. These birds will stage on the coast during fall migration and actually fly over the Atlantic to areas in the Caribbean and even as far south as South America. And there hasn't been a lot of studies done as yet to see if those birds are flying over where these wind facilities will be going, but B, whether they're flying at an altitude that would make them vulnerable to collisions. So that's something that remains to be addressed. And at the end of the day, we know there will be impacts, and we're not yet hearing about how we're going to see compensatory mitigation to offset those impacts. So these are all discussions that are being had, and we think are challenges that can be addressed. We just need to make them happen. So we've got a sense for what the problems are here. There are certainly some legal protections in place. Looking specifically at federal laws, of course, we have the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which is specific to those two species and does certainly come into play with wind energy development in areas where those species are present. That is something that we are often telling developers that they should be obtaining permits from the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly for golden eagles. Of course, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that one's been a little bit of a political football over the last 4 years, but we're very grateful that the Biden administration is taking steps to not only restore lost protections, but at this point actually strengthen the MBTA and potentially move forward with a permitting system, which would really do a lot to operationalize that law. The Endangered Species Act, of course, applies to the rarest of species, and National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, applies in those instances where there's a federal nexus and does provide some level of rigor to environmental analyses and looking at environmental impacts. But if you put all of this together, really the federal government is only typically involved in wind energy project planning and permitting under certain circumstances for certain species. And I think it's fair to say that most projects do not have federal involvement as part of their planning. And when you look a little more closely, there are state and local regulations. Some states do have fantastic regulations with regard to wind energy. A lot of states have next to none. There are a lot of states where there really is very little in the way of review or oversight of these projects, which can be really problematic in areas that are important for birds. And this figure just gives kind of an overview of that authority issue. The states in green are where only the local government is responsible for decision-making on wind energy projects. The yellow is where it's the state only, and the blue is split authority between local and state. And interestingly, even this is a little bit out of date. There has been some movement on that. New York State has actually gone to essentially a state-only regulatory process. And I want to say that Maryland, and I should have verified this beforehand, but I think Maryland went to a state process as well, but I'd have to verify that. Continuing on with what the existing protections are for birds with regard to wind energy development, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service developed their land-based wind energy guidelines in 2012. These were a result of a collaborative effort with various federal and state agencies, academics, and the wind energy industry, among others. And this really is a blueprint. It's a very high-level blueprint for how to design and plan and construct and operate wind energy facilities in a way that minimizes its impacts to wildlife. This is a great document, tried and true, and one that we're a big fan of. It was unfortunately made voluntary. So when this was released, it was decided that these would be voluntary rather than mandatory. And for a long time, it was unclear how effective they were for various reasons, until fairly recently, when the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies did a survey. They asked state fish and wildlife biologists who work at the intersection of wildlife protection and wind energy development, contacted them for a survey, a very lengthy survey, a lot of different questions about their views on wind energy and wildlife. But the one that I pulled out here is, how effective do you think the federal wind energy guidelines are at supporting low impact wind siting? Because at the end of the day, that is what we want as the outcome of the wind energy guidelines, is how well do they steer wind energy facilities to the right locations? And just over 3% said very effective, 50% said somewhat effective, and about a third said not very effective or not at all effective. So this certainly could have been worse, but it could have been a whole lot better as well. So at the end of the day, we need renewable energy to combat climate change. That much is abundantly clear. But we also know that we need to take some precautions when we're planning and building these facilities. And so American Bird Conservancy fully supports wind energy development, but it must be bird smart. And so our bird smart wind energy strategy has a number of facets. First and foremost, we promote best practices. We want to get out there and make sure that people are doing this the right way, because you can have renewable energy and have strong bird conservation, but you've got to be smart about the way you approach it. We do engage at the project level. Generally speaking, this is when we find that there are projects that are being proposed in the wrong locations that are going to have disproportionately negative impacts to birds. We do focus on a handful of priority areas and species, and I'll give a couple of examples here in a few slides. We do focus a lot on meaningful communications. American Bird Conservancy does have a bit of a unique role in this space. There are a number of organizations that have folks that work in the renewable energy sector. We like to think that we have a unique voice and bring a unique perspective to this conversation. And we do a fair bit of work on policy, primarily at the federal, but also at the local level. So looking at the first of the pieces on that list is promoting best practices. So this is what we call our principles of bird smart wind energy development. This is at a very high level, our rendition of what is required to appropriately plan, develop, and operate a wind energy facility. And I'm not going to go into all of these because it is after 8 o'clock and I want to keep everybody awake. And that was interesting. I don't know how I just did that. Apologies, folks. So moving back. All right. So I do want to touch on a few of these though. So the first one is likely impacts are evaluated. So this is a really important step. You've actually got to get out on a site if you're considering a place for development. You've got to actually get out there and you've got to do field surveys and you've got to figure out what's there. Because there are some places obviously where we have plenty of data, we know what birds are out there, and maybe in some locations you don't have to do quite as much field work, but there are a whole lot of locations that we really don't have any idea who's there, or we only have a vague idea. So you've got to get out there and you've got to get the data to figure out what birds and other wildlife exist in a location before you can really start to move forward with planning. Because number two, and the absolute most important, is that turbines are sited in low risk areas for birds. And this is the most important because so far there's not a lot of technology that allows you to minimize the impacts of wind turbines once they're built. There's not a lot of noisemakers or strobe lights or anything to that effect. And obviously folks are trying to work on these things and trying to develop these kinds of technologies, but as of yet, we just don't have that silver bullet yet to keep birds away from turbines once they're built. So it really is imperative that we're putting the turbines in the right place in the first place. And number 5, and this is something that we consistently hammer on, is that compensatory mitigation has to be provided. At the end of the day, again, we of course really need these turbines and we really need renewable energy, but we have to be offsetting the losses of birds from this development with on-the-ground conservation measures to compensate for losses. So continuing with the thread of promoting best practices, this is a one-page fact sheet that we've developed. It's available in both English and Spanish, but this just provides a really high-level overview of the issue, why this matters to birds, and it does include our Bird Smart Wind Energy principles, and this is something that we provide to decision makers and anyone else who might be interested. We developed what we call our wind risk assessment map. This is available on our website. And this is a map of areas of importance for birds where developers might want to avoid, really steer clear of when considering areas to develop wind facilities, or areas where they might want to take extra precautions. So the red areas here, a lot of those are public lands. Those are areas that folks really should be staying out of anyway. But when you get into the dark orange and the lighter orange, these are getting into some areas that are a little higher level or sometimes species focused. Like if you see the stripe right down the middle, it almost looks like somebody used a paint roller. That's the migratory corridor of the whooping crane. And if you look at the light orange along the Appalachian Mountains, that's a raptor migratory corridor. So that's not to say absolutely no, don't go in there, don't build wind turbines, but it means this is a resource that we've made available to developers, agencies, and other folks who are interested to say, okay, we're looking at this area, or a wind facility's been proposed in this area. You can come to the map and say, okay, well, we know that there's a large concentration of migratory raptors in this area, so we definitely need to get out and do raptor surveys for this project. So this really is just an informative resource for anyone involved in the industry. Now moving into project level engagement. Again, we do get involved in individual projects, in particular when the impacts are going to be particularly egregious, or if it's going to set a really important precedent. The upper left here is a news story about a project that we were involved in a couple of years ago in Humboldt County, California. This project was relatively near the coast, and it was in an area where it was known to be in, it was in basically the transit lanes for nesting marbled murrelets as they made their movements from the ocean to their nest and back, one fish at a time to feed their chicks. Not a great area for wind turbines, because we know that marbled murrelets do a lot of their movements in very low light when the turbines would not be visible. It was also a known hawkwatch site. Both bald and golden eagles were frequently seen on this location, among many other things. So when you put it all together, it was just abundantly clear that this was a really bad site for a wind energy facility. And we made that known, as did many other people, and that project was ultimately rejected. The bottom right here, this is one that is actually currently going on in northwestern New York. It's a project where there's a large wetland complex otherwise surrounded by agricultural fields. And the wetland complex encompasses a national wildlife refuge and 2 wildlife management areas. And a company has proposed wind turbines right at the edge of the wetland complex, in an area that is also known to be kind of a super highway for nocturnal migrants moving between the eastern edge of Lake Erie and the southern portion of Lake Ontario. So for this one, we're not saying no to the facility. We're just saying you've got 6 turbines entirely too close to this wind energy. I'm sorry, too close to this wetland complex. So every scenario is different. And unfortunately, there's still no algorithm that tells us for sure when a turbine or a facility is or is not okay. So there is some human judgment, but we know a lot about birds and we know a lot about this issue, and we're always on the lookout for projects that are going in the wrong places. We do have a handful of priority areas and species. Not just going to list those, but just maybe talk about a couple. We do pay a lot of attention to the whooping crane. There was a paper that came out last year that found that whooping cranes avoid stopover locations. They avoid wind turbines by a distance of 5 kilometers. So if there are wind turbines proposed within 5 kilometers of an area that they might otherwise use as a stopover location to rest and refuel during migration, that would render that stopover site unusable. So very problematic. On the right here, of course, is the golden eagle. This is a bird that most people think of as a bird of wide open western spaces, but there is also an eastern population. And you can see in the map here on the bottom, these birds breed primarily in far northeastern Canada, but they do actually migrate through and winter in the Appalachian Mountains. And I'm just completely enamored with this population. I think it's the coolest thing. There's only about 5,000 of these birds, so it's a relatively small population. And part of what's so interesting about these birds is that they actually primarily occupy large areas of forest. So they're going to be found typically in the Appalachians in fairly remote areas. But it's very interesting because that is so unique for this species to be found in the forest, these forested areas. And they use ridge lines, cliffs, and steep slopes. The ridge lines in particular also happen to be where some of the best wind energy resources are in this part of the country. So there is inherent conflict between where these birds are migrating and where they spend their winter and wind energy development. And that's something that we expect to see more of. And so this map, it's a little bit difficult to see the outline, but this is the state of Maryland. And the dots here represent, this is from the US Wind Turbine Database again. So the dots out here represent where the wind turbines are located in the state of Maryland. And you can see these are generally present in a fairly linear pattern. And so it really demonstrates that that's where the wind energy development is in this part of the country, is on those ridge lines in the Appalachian Mountains. And we know that there's at least one other facility that is in the later stages of planning and approval, Dance Mountain Wind, which would be out fairly near Cumberland. But as you can see, this also overlaps with the areas that eastern golden eagles are both migrating and spending their winter. So this really illustrates that conflict, and that really kind of growing conflict between eastern golden eagles and wind energy development. So moving into our communications piece, again, we have a really unique role and a unique voice in this space, but we try to get out and we try to tell things the way we see them. And this is really across the board in terms of policy, onshore wind, offshore wind, and everything in between. And one I did want to highlight that I'm very excited about, this came out here just very recently, a blog post on the eastern golden eagle, which is available on our blog if anybody wanted to read more about that. Moving into the policy realm, again, we do focus most of our efforts on federal policy. This is one bill that we've been trying to move through Congress for a number of years in conjunction with a number of other partners. This is the Migratory Bird Protection Act. And so the intent here would be to strengthen the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and it would require industries that have substantial negative impacts on birds to use best management practices, either existing or ones that would be developed. And so in essence, the intent would be to just ensure that things are being done right in the first place. And this would require a permit. And this would provide not only protections for birds, but also regulatory certainty. One thing we hear from industry a lot is that they're uncomfortable with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act because it's really inconsistently enforced. This very simple general permit would provide a very easy way to go about providing that certainty and these protections for birds. Sticking with the federal level, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is also anticipated to be revised here in terms of the implementing regulations. This is an action alert that we had out here very recently. The comment period is closed, so this action alert is no longer active, but we know that there are changes coming to the way the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is enforced. The early signs indicate that there is a lot of focus on streamlining the process. At the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with efficiency as long as it's preserving the integrity and the protections. So we're paying very close attention to this to make sure that we still maintain strong protections for both species of eagle and particularly golden eagle, which has a lower overall population and is not been increasing the way bald eagle populations have. We do occasionally get involved in policy at the state level. One that I wanted to flag here is the state of Virginia just this year implemented a regulation that is very similar to the Migratory Bird Protection Act. So they implemented a regulation in Virginia where various industries, very specific industries, would have to adhere to best practices in development and construction of their projects, and that would occur through a simple permitting system that would happen at the state level. So we were very excited. We helped the state to develop those regulations, but this really did come down to the governor and all the folks at the Department of Wildlife Resources making this happen, and we were very excited about that. Here on the right, there was an article in the Chicago Sun-Times where somebody suggested that the state of Illinois should follow suit and have their own migratory bird protection regulation. And so I'll just go ahead and float that because I know that Maryland Ornithological Society is very active on the policy front. We would certainly love to see the state of Maryland follow suit on this and would be happy to have discussions to that effect. Looking back at our Bird Smart wind energy guidelines here, or the one more that I wanted to touch on is all renewable alternatives are considered. There are times where we find a facility being proposed in an inappropriate location and we say, well, gee, why didn't you think about solar? A solar facility would be just fine here. And somebody says, yeah, we're a wind energy developer, we don't do solar. That's not a very good answer. So we like people to think in advance about what are the right forms of energy to have in any particular location. But one that we are particularly fans of is distributed solar. And so distributed solar, of course, includes rooftop solar on people's homes or on commercial buildings or on anything in the urban environment, but also on parking lots or industrial sites, anywhere where you have basically the habitat removed or otherwise degraded to the point where you're not losing valuable wildlife habitat. Get solar panels on it. We'd love to see solar panels everywhere there are not birds. And part of the beauty is that this avoids wildlife impacts. There are no studies that we're aware of, but we also haven't heard any anecdotal evidence even that birds collide with solar panels on roofs. We do know that hundreds of thousands of birds are killed each year in collisions with solar panels at utility scale facilities, but we're not hearing anything of the sort on rooftops. But that's just part of the beauty of distributed solar. It's also a very powerful job creator. You think about the amount of time it takes to install and maintain solar panels on roofs as opposed to a utility scale facility. That's going to create and maintain a lot of jobs. And there's less need for grid infrastructure. I spoke earlier about the need for additional power lines, transmission lines to connect wind energy facilities to the energy grid. You don't need to do that when it's on your roof. You're essentially turning the source of use into a source of power generation. So it's a really efficient and powerful way to approach this. And there was a study conducted very recently, released very recently by the Nature Conservancy and Defenders of Wildlife, where they looked at the capacity, the potential capacity for what they called low impact solar potential on Long Island in New York. And so this is rooftop, but again, it's also solar facilities and otherwise degraded lands where essentially you would not be losing wildlife habitat. And the results was they found that there was more potential capacity for low impact solar than is used on Long Island on an annual basis. And this is really pretty incredible because as I'm sure we can all imagine, there's a lot of power used on Long Island, but they're saying that without destroying any additional wildlife habitat, you could get enough solar panels out there to generate all of the energy needed for the entire island. So a pretty remarkable outcome. So I'm going to spend a couple of slides here talking about how to get involved. If you're excited about ABC, certainly you can become an ABC member, and I'll drop these links into the chat when this is all done here. You can also sign up for ABC e-news. We get things out to folks in a variety of different ways. Every week we have the bird of the week, which is pretty cool. It's always some nice photos and a description of a bird. We have an e-news that comes out once a month. We have various other mailers, but always interesting, pretty lighthearted. Our communications team is just absolutely dynamite. So always love that stuff. And becoming a member gets you the Bird Conservation magazine there on the right, which is always a stunner. I also have a Bird Smart Wind Energy newsletter. This comes out 3 or 4 times a year, and that's something that I'll drop into the chat as well. But again, tends to be pretty high level, just some of the highlights of what's been going on in the birds and wind energy scene in the recent months. For those who have an advocacy bent, there are ways to actually take action for birds, and you would get on our website, go to the Get Involved tab up there at the top. That takes you to another menu where you can say take action on urgent issues. And we do tend to have active action alerts at any given time. One that is currently open is telling Congress to support Bird Smart Wind Energy. We have a lot of conversations with members of Congress to try to get them to remember birds when they're adding additional dollars for wind energy development into budgets and all the various things that have been coming out. We're still hopeful that we can get some of those sidebars up because we're certainly expecting an acceleration of this development in the coming years. And the more they hear from folks like you, the more likely they are to pay attention to that. Here's a couple of recent action alerts. I already mentioned the one on the left. On the right is one telling Congress to continue moving the Migratory Bird Protection Act through. Again, we are hoping to see the Biden administration move forward with a permitting process for MBTA, but having the durability of actually having that implemented in law would really go even that much further and have that much more effect for birds. And realize it's getting a little bit late here, so luckily we're at the question slide. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was great. I have a question. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not. I read that if we took a 10 by 10 square in the southwest of the US and built a solar farm there, that it would supply all the electricity that the US needed in a year. And we'd have to build up the grid for that. But that seems like it would be a less impactful thing to do than many of the things that people are trying to do.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. A lot of that really does come down to the grid. I mean, we saw what happened in Texas when the wind turbines froze and suddenly renewables became the demon for basically everything briefly. But yeah, I mean, our energy grid really is not suited for that yet. That's part of the infrastructure bill that has been passed, is to provide upgrades to the energy grid. So that is going to allow access to parts of the country that are currently less accessible, particularly for the large population centers. So things like that may become more possible. But at the end of the day, there are impacts from solar energy as well. We just don't understand them quite as well. We know that large numbers of birds do collide with solar panels in these utility scale facilities, but we haven't yet figured out exactly why. We have some good hypotheses, but we haven't yet been able to come up with a formula that says if the solar panels are this close to a water body, or if they're in an otherwise arid area, or whatever it is. You know, we just kind of haven't figured out those patterns yet to be able to predict it. So it could be that would be beneficial for birds overall, but we don't know for sure.
Joel, I have a question if no one has a question right now. Thank you very much. This was a great talk, really. I would like to know, at the end of the day, are you optimistic about the possibility to kind of regulate the wind energy industry, and how do the wind energy developers see groups like ABC, for example, as someone who prevents them from doing their living, or are they cooperative?
Sure. Am I optimistic? At the moment, I am cautiously optimistic. We have seen in writing that the Biden administration is again considering a permitting process for MBTA, and that would make a huge difference. I mean, that would really make a huge difference. And again, that would come without a major burden for industry. So I really do think that would be a win-win situation. There are other realms, eagles and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, where I'm less optimistic in terms of what I'm currently hearing and where I expect that conversation to go. But we would certainly like to continue to have conversations with folks in Congress and make sure that they're remembering birds when all these bills are being proposed, because we think this all can be done right. It just requires the political will to actually get it done. In terms of how we're viewed by developers, you know, different organizations that are working in this space take different approaches. We certainly feel strongly that there needs to be some accountability. We do, again, fully support wind energy development as a necessary part of the broader strategy to combat climate change. But We also believe very strongly that wind turbines don't belong everywhere. And there are some places where we just need to make sure they don't happen. So I'm sure there are some in the industry who view us as a thorn in their side, but at the end of the day, we believe very strongly that when people are doing the wrong thing, they need to hear from the conservation community. So we're going to continue to be that voice as long as turbines are being proposed in the wrong places.
I have a question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Evelyn.
I was just going to say, and at the level of Maryland, what? So if now the Maryland government, the state government is in charge, let's say, is it cooperating with ABC?
I have not been involved in a wind energy facility in the state of Maryland as yet. I highlighted Dan's Mountain in the slide where I was showing the turbines that are present in the state. That one's been very contentious. I know it's currently tied up in courts. Had I been around when that one was proposed, maybe I would have had something to say about it, because I think a fair few golden eagles do fly through there. And I do find it very frustrating when there are known to be eagles and developers don't feel the need to get an eagle permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service, though that is unfortunately often the norm. I've had a conversation with US Wind, who's looking to develop one of the wind facilities off the coast of Maryland. They're doing some good monitoring there. Looks like they're trying to do the right things. So it really depends on the facility. It depends on the facility and it depends on the developer. But the state of Maryland obviously has a really great track record on conservation, has really good environmental policies, and has really good folks in the legislature and certainly representation in federal Congress. So I would certainly be optimistic that Maryland would find a way to do the right thing.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah, so this is Paul Pisano. Great presentation, Joel, and kudos to ABC for walking that fine line between being pro-wind and pro-bird, and how to recognize that there you can be both, but there's also other alternatives. Question, I have a bunch of questions, but I guess the one I really want to talk to is, I don't think you talked about this, is other turbine designs that are not so bad to birds, like instead of the super long blades, the more cylindrical designs of turbines, and what's the status of that? Or are they just not efficient enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. And historically, I've actually had a slide about that. And it's funny because I finally got rid of the slide because I got tired of figuring out that the ones I'd been talking about have gone a belly up. So that's kind of been the story. There have been a number of different designs to try to harness the wind that haven't ultimately panned out. There was one that kind of looked like a French horn almost, where it would, funnel it down and turn rotors in the end. There was one that was going to be a giant kite. That one may still be somewhere out there, but there are a number of things. I saw one the other day that would actually be in the urban environment. It would be a small one that would go alongside highways. So it would actually harness the energy of cars whizzing past. There's one that's being considered that's actually, it would just be a giant cylinder, basically, on the landscape, and it would kind of gyrate, I think, when the wind comes, and that one's still viable. So you're absolutely right. There are other designs even still that are being considered, and ultimately we're going to have to, we have to come up with something else, because we've got the human ingenuity. We've been using wind turbines to develop electricity for 2,000 years. We've got to be able to find another way, right?
Right.
I understood that there was some research on using different colored lights. Some lights repel birds and some attract them. They were using them on cell towers. Is that a useful way of repelling birds from these turbines?
Yeah, not yet. There's, in terms of, lighting is kind of a whole separate issue, because birds that migrate at night, a lot of songbirds orient using natural light. And so they can become disoriented and confused and end up in the wrong places and crashing into buildings and crashing into structures when there are lights. And so the gig with communications towers is to replace steady burning white lights with flashing red lights. And that's been found to dramatically reduce the number of bird collisions. In terms of wind turbines, a lot of it comes down to not putting those steady burning white lights on them. Like in the offshore realm, there are technologies that are being implemented where in essence, for some of these turbines, the folks that really need to see these turbines are aircraft, because these are really, especially the ones going in the marine waters, are huge structures. And so they have some that are actually able to detect aircraft, and they come on long enough to let the aircraft get by safely, and then they shut back off. But as yet, nobody's found a particular light or color or strobe that actually repels birds. Again, maybe somebody will cook up something at some point, but so far there just hasn't been that silver bullet yet.
Wasn't there a small, very small pilot study, I think from Norway, where they painted one of the blades black, and they had side-by-side comparisons with windmills that weren't painted, and they found a slight decrease in the bird mortality.
Yes.
Being followed.
Yes. And I really appreciate the way you framed that. Yes. It was a small pilot study. It's really interesting. That study got an incredible amount of press. It got an incredible amount of press. I probably read a dozen stories that covered that. It really captured people's imaginations. But yes, you're exactly right. It was a study in Norway, and it was a facility that had 54, maybe 64 turbines, something like that. But they had treatment control, paired treatment control turbines, where one had a single turbine, blade of the turbine painted black, and the other one that did not. And then they looked at the difference in bird mortality at the two, and it's a fairly long-term study. I think it was over 5 or 6 years. And it did find that there was less bird mortality at the treated turbines with the blade painted black. But yes, very, very small sample size, and a very specific location and setting. I know that generated a lot of excitement, and I think, and I'm fairly certain that there are steps being taken to try to replicate that on a larger scale in the US to see if that would work for bird species here or at all, frankly, again, given the very small sample size. But if there was something that simple, it sure would be a game changer. So certainly optimistic that will ultimately prove to be useful.
Have there been any long-term studies, like maybe in Europe, where they've had the turbines up for 20 years to see if birds will change their behavior? Like you talked about the red-throated loons, avoiding a turbine by 10 miles. Well, maybe over time they would become more accustomed to it. Has anybody looked at that, or is that a version that they take permanently?
That's a good question. I know there was a study. There was a series of studies at a facility in Wisconsin, because there was a very important protected area, Horicon Marsh National Wildlife Refuge, and there was a wind facility that was proposed east of that, and there was a lot of consternation about it. People weren't sure if that was a good idea. It was ultimately placed 2 miles from the marsh, and there were studies done over a series of years, and one of the studies found that over the near term that raptors, red-tailed hawks in particular, did decline. That's one of the species that has more recently been predicted for the potential for population level declines due to wind energy development. So that's not a huge surprise. But interestingly, I think maybe 7 years later, another study was done that found that the population seemed to have rebounded. So I don't know what mechanism that would be. I don't think that's, I don't think we're seeing natural selection over 7 years. So I don't know exactly what that mechanism would be. It could also be, it could conceivably be a fluke, but to compare that to another site, there's gosh, I'm drawing a blank here. Altamont Pass, there it is. Altamont Pass Wind Resource Area in California. It's a gigantic wind energy facility that's been it's been in place for, I think, close to 30 years at this point. But that one really is kind of the boogeyman of wind energy facilities. That's the one that really got the world's attention in terms of the number of birds that wind turbines are capable of killing. And it's in real claim to infame is the number of golden eagles it kills. And there was a study conducted out there by a bunch of folks at USGS and elsewhere that found that golden eagle numbers at the facility appeared stable if you were just out counting the birds. But once you started looking at an individual level, what they figured out was that the only reason that the numbers were stable was because birds were migrating in at such high rates that the birds were replacing essentially all of the birds that were being killed at the facility. So they actually went so far as to say that the numbers were only maintained by continental scale migration. So just having stable numbers really doesn't tell the whole story. That was a very long answer to your question. I hope that was helpful.